Hello, everyone. I'm your People Behind the Science podcast host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and I'm excited to welcome you to episode 648 of the show. Today, we are going to be chatting with our guest, Dr. Nathan Smith, and I'm glad to have you all joining me today for our interview. If you want to continue meeting fantastic scientists through our show, you can follow us on Twitter at PBT Science, and I'm at Ph.D. Marie. Now, today, Nathan is going to share some of his own experiences in his life, his career, and his research. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our exceptional people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Nathan Smith. So, Nathan, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We're excited to have you here. But before we go into our interview questions, let me take a few moments here to tell our listeners a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are today. Listeners, Nathan will soon be starting his new roles as Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion in Research and Research Education, as well as Associate Professor of Neuroscience in the School of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Rochester. Currently, he is Director of Basic Neuroscience Research and a Principal Investigator in the Center for Neuroscience Research at Children's National Research Institute, as well as an Assistant Professor of Pediatrics and Pharmacology and Physiology at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Nathan received his bachelor's degree in biology from Xavier University and his master's and Ph.D. in neuroscience from the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. When he graduated in 2013, Nathan was the first African-American to receive a Ph.D. from the University of Rochester. And afterwards, Nathan conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Utah and Boston University, as well as at Children's National Hospital. Now, Nathan has received numerous awards and honors in his career, including being named a 2021 Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, receipt of the 2019 Neuroscience Alumni Award from the University of Rochester, and receipt of the 2018 Children's National President's Award for Innovation in Research. And today, Nathan, we're excited to get to know you not only as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you'd like to do when you're not doing science?
When I'm not doing science, what I really like to do is I work out, but more so in the form of practicing my martial arts. I am a black belt in mixed martial arts, or a form of mixed martial arts. It's known as Seidokan Karate. It's a karate form developed in Okinawa under Master Toma, and I have been doing that since graduate school, and I have enjoyed it thoroughly. And it actually helps me keep everything in balance, especially dealing with stress and everything else. I really enjoy it.
Oh, that's cool. And it sounds like this isn't a particular martial art that I've heard of before. How did you get introduced to it?
Actually, this is a funny story because one day I was working in the gym doing graduate school, and I heard another guy at the locker when I was getting ready to leave. He was talking about, he has to go to karate. And traditionally, I thought it was, Shotokan Karate, which I have taken in college. But no, he said, this is Seidokan Karate. It's a more flexible karate that has weaponry. It has forms of jujitsu, different tortes and everything else. And he's saying, you should check it out because it's really good and has a really good group of people. And I was like, sure. He gave me the details and I showed up and I loved it ever since. And in 2012, I received my black belt in the form.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
It was like serendipitously because I was looking for a style of karate to take up because I've done Shotokan, but I wanted something that would be a little more flexible, and Shotokan was the answer.
Oh, very cool. I love talking to people about their interests outside the lab just to show that scientists are these multifaceted people, that you're not just always thinking science 100% of the time. But we do want to talk about your scientific side as well. So, Nathan, this is something that I think a lot of scientists struggle with in terms of communicating what they do to the general public. So how do you describe your science to people who might not be familiar with your research or your field?
Well, at first, as scientists, when we start out, it's very difficult because we always think in big words and big terms. And usually when I describe my science to people in the beginning, I see their eyes glaze over. So now I keep it extremely basic and put it in more relative terms that they will understand. it took a long time to get to that stage because I think we learn as we go and we improve, and each iteration gets better and better and better. And one technique that people always talk about is like, oh, try to explain it like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old. And it has always been difficult to do that. But now I think I have a better grasp on that. So when I do explain my science to people, I use general terms. For example, I study a type of cell in the brain. This type of cell helps the brain perform certain aspects like blood flow. It helps certain cell types in the brain to communicate with one another, principal cell types like neurons. So usually they've heard those terms before, and I just build upon that as like small building blocks as we go in order to get them to understand exactly what my lab does.
Oh, very cool. I like this approach. And I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of an iteration that you have to take. Every time you talk to somebody, you kind of figure out what works, what doesn't work, what makes those eyes glaze over. So it's great to hear that you've perfected it.
And you see that all the time. And I've actually had lots of experience here while I was here in DC, because I usually go to career days at elementary schools, and then I go to middle schools and high schools. And usually I really want to keep it as general as possible for the elementary school students. And I just bring lots of props with me. And that actually helps me convey what scientists do as well as what my lab does.
Definitely. And I'm so glad to hear you're engaging in these outreach activities. So when you're out there talking to students, whether it's high school students, elementary school students, what is, I guess, something that has really surprised you about that experience of kind of getting out there and sharing your work?
The surprising thing is I always tell this story because it touched my heart so much. I remember when I went to my first elementary school here, Marie Reed in DC, and I needed a student helper. And one of the teachers appointed one of their students. And I remember him tugging on my lab coat, and he's like, "Excuse me, are you a doctor?" And I was like, "Yes." And he's like, "Do you think I can become a doctor one day?" And I was like, "Absolutely."
Aww.
And just as a scientist, and he was like stuck to me the entire day and helped me with all my props and everything else. Just the excitement and encouragement to know, yes, you can be anything you want to be. You have to put in hard work, but absolutely dream big. The world is your oyster. And I'm a staunch believer, and I've always been taught by my mother and grandmother, it's better to inspire, because every person has a unique ability to become anything they want to be. And it's usually better to inspire and encourage the younger generation and get them early on to see their true potential and what's out there. And so that shocked me, because he was like, "Do you really think I could do it?" I was like, "Yes, you can." And it just touched me. And that story lives with me forever, because when I told him, yes, he can, his eyes lit up. He was so excited. It just left the lasting impression on me.
I love this story, Nathan. And I really like to hear that you're getting out there working with students. And I think these early experiences can be so motivating and so inspiring, and something that stays with them for a lifetime. And I know this motivation and inspiration is key in science. We love to share little tidbits of motivation and inspiration with all of our listeners out there. So do you yourself have a favorite quote or a saying or a force or just something that really motivates and inspires you?
I was just actually talking to a colleague this morning, and I was like thinking about some of the quotes that my grandmother used. So I was very close to my grandmother, so that's why I always like bring it up. And one of the things she always taught me and kept reminding me over and over, and the quote is, "Never let anyone define who you are, because if they do, they will have complete control over you." And she referenced this quote every single time to help me realize that you can be anything you want to be. You have that potential. You have what it takes to go out and become anything you want to be. So don't let someone else negativity or shortcomings fall upon you when someone tells you based on a bad grade or whatever, "Oh, I don't think you could be a doctor. I don't think you could be this. I don't think you be that." And so she always said, never let anyone define who you are.
That is phenomenal. And Nathan, it sounds like your grandmother was a big influence throughout your life, perhaps. So these people in your life who motivate you, who inspire you, and who help shape you to become the person and the scientist you are so key. So are there others who really rise to the top of your mind as role models or mentors or people that you've looked up to?
Oh, absolutely. It starts first with my foundation of my mother and my grandmother, because their positive energy and their positive words every day going out as a person who's trying to succeed or get an education. They always say education is key. Your main job is getting an education. You have to get an education. and help pave the way for others. And then the second tier on top of that foundation from what I got at my home is my mentors. I've had the luxury of having some really good mentors throughout the years. I can't name them all, but mentors from as far as high school teachers, undergraduate teachers, and then when I went on to graduate school and everything else, mentors there, my graduate advisors, postdoc advisors, and just mentors from different programs I have been a part of, such as Minds and Brains, and also mentors from organizations where, like those programs I mentioned earlier, from different fellows, mentors amongst my peers. My peers are my mentors as well. We learn as we continue to grow. So I'm very fortunate to have mentors from all corners of the world, and where I've learned from them and they have learned from me. It has been a rewarding experience.
Oh, excellent. And you mentioned that your family really instilled in you in that early age that education is critically important. So you knew that this education had to happen, but what made you turn your eye towards science?
In high school, I always wanted to be a cardiologist because, well, my family, especially male members of my family, have suffered from lots of debilitating disease. I lost my brother at the age of 26 because he had a virus that attacked his heart. He passed away a few months before I graduated from college and when my sister was graduating from high school. My father, who passed away from diabetes. So those things have guided me into science because I wanted to do things to actually, rather than touch one person at a time, I look at becoming a scientist as doing something that can affect many people at once, finding something that actually improves the quality of life. And what turned me away from cardiology to the brain was Gifted Hands by Ben Carson. I really became fascinated with the brain. And that was one of the driving points for me to do neuroscience and keep pushing toward becoming a brain scientist to fight debilitating diseases that affect multiple people, but also that spark came from personal experiences with the losses of my grandfather, my brother, my father, uncle, etc.
Certainly. Well, I'm so sorry to hear about these losses. I know they can be really strong drivers, though. These personal experiences that scientists share are a common thread, I think, in a lot of people being interested in biomedical sciences, becoming a doctor, becoming a scientist. And it sounds like this was the case for you. So can you talk a little bit about how you went from this determined kid who wanted to be a cardiologist then to where you are today? What were some of these key moments along your career path?
Because my mother and grandmother were such huge cheerleaders, and growing up with them and amongst my sisters, my brother before he passed away, and my cousins. But my mother took a unique role, and usually with parents, and when you lose a parent and everything else, they become like, oh, you shouldn't go far. But my mother viewed it as opposite, right? She's like, I understand that education is key, and sometimes you're going to have to leave. And actually, not only my mother, but it was also a particular high school teacher. And she stated this clearly right before I graduated from high school. She's like, look, if you want to make something out of yourself, basically echoing the teachings of my grandmother and mother, if you want to make something out of yourself, you're going to have to leave the state of Louisiana. You're going to have to spread your wings and go where the opportunities are. Don't be afraid to apply all over. Now, my grandmother, on the other hand, was like, okay, go to college within the state of Louisiana because you're so close to us, right? Yeah. But for professional school, go outside of Louisiana. We know that there are opportunities out there. So they never stood in the way of me applying for different summer programs and going out and getting those opportunities. Like in college, when I really experienced leaving the state and going to opportunities, one was at Case Western Reserve. Another one was at the University of Minnesota. My mother never balked at this. She's like, absolutely, you have to go. But other members of the family was like, I can't believe you're letting him go all of these places. Are you not concerned about the security issues, et cetera, et cetera? But I was like, nope, he has to go where opportunities are. These opportunities will help him become what he wants to become, will help him achieve the goals that he's set out. And so I definitely embraced that because I remember so many times she had so many arguments with my aunts and the rest of the family who didn't let my cousins go out as much. But my mother never frowned upon any opportunity that came up. If an opportunity for me to leave the state for the summer or whatever, she's like, absolutely, I fully support this. You go out and get it. Because again, education is key.
Definitely. Was it intimidating for you then leaving the nest and just diving into these opportunities that were so far away from home?
Yes, it was, because I think it was also priming them in order for me to leave the nest, right? Mm-hmm. So it gave them opportunity to see what it was like. And so when I did graduate from college as a salutatorian, and one of the first African-American salutatorian within my predominantly white high school in the state of Louisiana, in Brule, Louisiana, I went to Xavier University of Louisiana because first they were rated number one in putting more African Americans in medical school than any of the Ivy League schools combined. And the program there was absolutely amazing. So when I went to Xavier, Dr. Carmichael, who was at the time head of the pre-med program, was like, he was very strict, and he was like, you can't take a summer off. You have to apply to programs. You have to go. My mother and grandmother agreed. You can go and do these things. But I think those experiences set everything into motion because I got to experience and meet people from all over and challenge myself by learning different things in neuroscience and medicine as well. It was just fascinating experience. Now, being an uncle, I always push my sisters and everyone else, you have to allow your kids to go to those experiences. Do not deny them an opportunity that could change their lives forever. And I look at it like that.
Oh, wonderful. I think it is so important to give students space to explore their interests, to kind of figure out what they want to do and who they want to be as an adult. So it's great to hear that you had those opportunities yourselves. And we mentioned, of course, your undergraduate there at Xavier. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided to go into that master's program and what drew you to the University of Rochester?
So I learned about the University of Rochester because at the time, Rochester sent out recruits to historical Black institutions, and Xavier was one of those recruits. And I remember going to one of the recruits' tables. At the time, the recruit was recruiting for medical school, but I learned all about Rochester from the recruit they sent down. And I was like, oh, this sounds really good. Rochester sounds really, really good. And actually, I also really like Case Western as well because, summer experiences really allowed me to see the different places. And I was like, oh, wow. I mean, there are opportunities out there. But during that time, I learned a lot about the University of Rochester. And I also learned that we had a lot of Xavier students who transitioned from undergrad to the University of Rochester. And that was very exciting for me. So when I applied, I was accepted during that time years. I did take a year off. Well, I did multiple things. So I applied, I did it's called a postbaccalaureate program. However, but it was a postbaccalaureate program with exchanges of different medical schools of New York. And so I did this program. Once I did that program, 1 year at UB, University of Buffalo, and then you go on and matriculate into the University of Rochester. But once I matriculated, I decided, you know what, I'm going to take a year off because a lot of things have happened. I've lost my brother and everything else. So I decided to take a year off to become a lab tech in orthopedics because prior to that experience, I did a summer program at the University of Rochester, like with Case, so I can learn about the university and everything else. And I got the unique opportunity to work with Dr. Jonathan Mink, who is the chair of pediatric neurology at the University of Rochester. And my project with Dr. Mink fell right in place because it was so amazing, fascinating. Since he's doing neurology, he looked at Tourette syndrome. He wanted to understand how basically antineuronal antibodies, the hypothesis was that they were seeing that a high prevalence of kids who have strep throat later on develop Tourette syndrome. So the question was, does antineuronal antibodies based on the strep throat will lead to Tourette syndrome or verbal tic? And so the model that we were working in, we looked at primate, we wanted to create a primate model of Tourette syndrome. And I also got to do clinic with him. And Dr. Mink, amazing, absolutely amazing, a doctor and mentor, as well as I got to see both facets of both research and clinic aspects. But I think that was one of the sparks. It's like, you know what, neuroscience is for me. But during that time, he gave me a piece of advice. He said, if neuroscience is for you, I suggest you do research in an area that you're unfamiliar with. And then if you do that and you succeed in that area and you see if neuroscience, it's the end all be all. Get experience elsewhere first before you make the final determination. And so I did. And that's when I took a year off and I did orthopedics. And within 6 months of my orthopedic rotation, working with Dr. Hisham Drissi in orthopedics, a new investigator and orthopedic research center there, I got my first ortho paper, and it was everything else. I mean, it went really well. And I remember going back to Dr. Mink, and I was like, you know what? I still have the neuroscience bug. And he's like, good, this is great. And based on all of this transpired in me joining the laboratory of Dr. Mink in Nidegard, who is a force to be reckoned with herself, an amazing and inspiring neuroscientist. And I always call it one of the mothers of glial biology because she's done so much and contributed so much to our understanding of how my cell, the astrocytes, which have been viewed as supportive cells for so long, moving them from being support cells to actual cells that are just more than support cells. So I joined her lab and it went from there. The neuroscience bug lived on, and that started it all. But it was due to that advice from Dr. Mink, just to see, because sometimes we jump into things and as we progress, it's like we learn that, oh, maybe this wasn't a good idea. Maybe it wasn't for me. But that advice was like, do something that you're unfamiliar with and probably not interested in, and then see if you still have that neuroscience bug to go into neuroscience. And it worked out really well.
Oh, that is fantastic advice. I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes you do need to try a few things and figure out what you don't like to sort of confirm what you think you do like. So
exactly. And most of the time we're programmed, right? As a student, we're programmed to we do 3 rotations and that was supposed to help us out. But sometimes the rotation is quite short and everything else. And then you have this confined window to choose what you're going to actually do your thesis on. So you have to rush through those rotations, which are short. And based on that, I was very lucky that I took a year. I had a whole year to determine and still was able to progress in a field that I didn't even think about, studying the bone and then moving on to neuroscience it is, and to go on and become a neuroscientist.
Oh, very cool. And I know, Nathan, you have some phenomenal research going on in your lab today. So if you had to narrow it down to just one project that you are most excited about at the moment, what would that be?
The project that is very exciting right now, because we have lots of good data, even though I love the astrocytes and everything else, I have to say it has to deal with our acute insulin resistance study that's going on right now. My postdoc is pushing forward, and this project is a consortium project with 2 other major universities, with Stony Brook and MGH. Although all my projects are important, but we're seeing some really fascinating data from this particular project of looking at how acute insulin resistance help destabilize neural networks.
Interesting. Well, this sounds like a fascinating project when you think about, I guess, the bigger picture and what the kind of impact that this project might have. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the relevance to everyday life and the broader impacts?
Absolutely. So if we figure out, because we're looking at acute insulin resistance, because we know what happens down the line, right? We know what happens in diabetes, everything else, the destruction of that. So basically looking at acute early onset and what happens in that very early phase, we don't know much about. And the real quest is, could we provide some type of therapeutic intervention to actually supersede what's to come down the line? Could we find this critical window of particular treatment with insulin resistance? Because we know insulin resistance is a major problem, especially as we see the diabetic rate in the United States rise. So the huge impact of this study is we know once we find that critical window of intervention, could we actually save the debilitating effects that we know insulin resistance / diabetes have on the brain itself?
Oh, very cool. Well, Nathan, thank you for giving us some details about what you're working on at the moment. And I know things aren't always exciting, bright, sunny days in science. So when you think about some of the challenges you've faced, are there particular moments that you've gone through in your career where it just felt like everything was going wrong, or you had a major failure and things were falling apart? Because I think sharing these stories is important for our listeners who might be undergoing the same things themselves.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think sharing it, because again, it is not all rosy, right? It's not always sunshine. You do have those up days and you have your down days. And I think also for me, those downsides is like submit grant applications. I've submitted many grant applications where sometimes they're not discussed or where they're not funded, et cetera, or a publication was rejected. But you keep going, right? It's not the end of the world. Yes, you're angry, you get upset a little bit, and it's like, how could they not see the genius in this? I see the genius, right? But you pick yourself up and you keep going. You wait for your summary sheets to come in and you review. It's like, okay, what did they see wrong? What did I miss because I'm too close to it? And how can we actually improve it and keep going? And the one thing I learned throughout my academic trajectory was the fact that you have to be persistent. And I come from a very resilient group of people. And as an African-American, we have been resilient. And that's one thing I always rely on. It's like, yes, if my grant is not discussed or not funded, I take a day to soak. And then I was like, okay, time to get to work. How am I going to improve it? How am I going to get it better? But you just have to remember that you have up and down days. And that's a part of the whole academic trajectory. Not everything is going to work out 100%. And if you go in it thinking that everything is going to work out 100%, then you're setting yourself up for a whole slew of disappointments. And I always like to tell people, I'm a perpetual optimist. I am one of the biggest optimists out there. And again, you have to throw in some realism as well. It's like, you're not going to get every grant you submit on the first try, right? You're going to have to refine and improve and keep going and persist and resubmit. And then if it doesn't get it the second time, you resubmit. But persistence and resilience pays off, because in the end, you will get those papers published and you will get those grants funded. But you have to keep going. And in each iteration, as we talked about early on, each iteration, you become stronger and you become more resistant as you go, right? But again, I can tell you, I've been a receiving end of a lot of not funded grants and then funded grants, but you grow thick skin, and you also use those moments as teachable moments, especially to your trainees, to show them that, hey, it's okay if you don't succeed the first time, the second or third time, but to keep going. You utilizing your personal story to help inspire them to keep moving forward. Don't give up. If you get a B or a C on the first exam, it's not the end of the world. Keep going, right? And that's how I turn my experience into teachable moments for my trainees, because I want them to understand that everything is not going to work out the first time, but with persistence and resilience, you'll get there. You'll get to where you want to go.
Definitely. And I think this is such an important message that many young scientists don't realize. So it's important to share that with everybody. But for you specifically, you mentioned that these can be down days when grants or papers are rejected or you don't get funding. But is there a particular example that you can think of where it was like you really thought this grant was amazing and you really thought your chances were good, and then you were really surprised when those reviews came back?
I can truly say for my KO1, which is Career Development Award for independent investigators, when I submitted the first time, I thought, oh, yes, it's great. It's going to be funded. It was not discussed. When I submitted the second time, it was scored, but not a fundable score. So it was scored on the higher end. So NIH scoring, the range is a 1 is the best and a 10 is the worst. And I think I got a 45. And it wasn't funded, right? And so again, in the third time, and then it was funded. So those are the moments, right? With individual awards, the same. And I can also talk about not just as being an independent investigator, but even as a graduate student, when I did my F31, my NRSA for grad school diploma, I submitted it the first time and it was not even discussed. So I waited, I regrouped, I waited for the summary statement and everything else. And it went from a not discussed to a 14 percentile and funded.
Oh, wow.
So people always share their success stories. But again, I'm glad you asked that question, because it is true. We have a lot of non-success stories that people should be aware of, to understand that, again, you have ups and downs, but don't let those downs be the deciding factor for you not to keep going and keep moving forward.
Definitely. And I love that both of these examples of sort of failures or being rejected for these grants and these funding opportunities had a happy ending, because I think it is important to show people that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that all of this effort, this struggle pays off. So for you, Nathan, do you have a favorite success story, a favorite victory in science that you can tell us about?
I think my favorite success story was actually achieving my Ph.D. on June 24th, 2013. And learning that I was the first African-American to receive a Ph.D. in neuroscience from the University of Rochester, which is great to celebrate, and great to be one of those people who are now paving the way. But when you think about it, it's like 2013.
It's remarkable it didn't happen sooner. Yeah.
Exactly. When you think about how long the university has been around, and learning later on that in 2020, they graduated the first Black female. So that's my success story, is just getting that and then setting an example. Again, using my personal narrative as an example to keep forging forward no matter what. Because you'll have a lot of hiccups along the way, and I did. Throughout my academic career, as I progressed through my academic career trajectory, you run into a lot of roadblocks, but you have to learn how to climb them or go around them and find ways in order to survive. I knew that giving up was not an option. So I always look back at that moment on June 24, 2013 was one of my biggest achievements in academia.
Well, congratulations. And I know this diversity, equity, and inclusion are all still kind of a work in progress in science. And this is something that's going to be a major focus of your new position that you'll be starting soon. So can you talk a little bit about this aspect of your career and why you really want to dedicate your time to this area?
We look at it like this, because when George Floyd was brutally murdered by a police officer in Minnesota, every institution, everybody was throwing out their word to support. But we've seen this before, right? Breonna Taylor, with Trayvon Martin, et cetera, et cetera. And the one defining moment that was different from the rest is because you have this wave of support and then it just fades away from those other things. And I think, although my people didn't create this inequity or this problem in academia when it comes to people of color, but I do believe that it's a problem that needs all hands on deck. And one of the issues that I always have a problem with, and that always bothered me, was the fact that no one ever asked me or any of my colleagues that I've talked to when it comes to the particular resources a person of color needs, or a person with disability needs, or what a woman needs when we go in for these positions. Our opinions are not asked. So with this new position at University of Rochester, I will have a seat at the table. And I think having a seat at the table and finally having my opinion asked, and it's like, okay, do you think this is work? Or also having ideas to actually strengthen and broaden and make an academic environment in Rochester a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable environment. And hopefully, if it's successful, again, it won't be done overnight. I can't wave a magic wand to fix the problem, because this is embedded in the foundation of academia. And it has been there for a very long time. Because again, we didn't create the problem. Women and people of color and people with disabilities did not create this issue. We were mostly excluded from the table. We were mostly excluded when they formulated these departments and everything else. And we're mostly excluded when we are invited. And usually when we are the only one, it's like, oh, we are called to take a picture and put on a pamphlet. But again, we're not given the resources and everything else. So that's what drove me to accept the position at University of Rochester, not only to help my research forge ahead because they have a great neuroscience community there, but also I saw an opportunity where this university in particular is listening and actually is putting a huge amount of resources behind this effort to actually make a difference and impact across the board for the entire university.
Definitely. And I think this position will allow you, it sounds like, to address some major gaps in the scientific community, or at least to be making progress in that direction. So I am so glad you are taking this opportunity to make a positive change in the world of science. So we appreciate that. And I know balancing the positions of Associate Dean and also Associate Professor are going to be a challenge. You're going to have a lot of reading to do, a lot of work to do, but we do like to encourage all of our listeners out there to maintain balance in their life, to take some time out for themselves, and particularly to take some time out to read, whether it's related to science or not. So Nathan, can you give our listeners out there some recommendations for books that you've enjoyed that they can check out when they're looking for their next great read?
I have several, actually. And when you brought this topic up, I started like, oh, let me open my Audible because I use that most of the time. And one of the books that I truly enjoyed, especially because we just talked about diversity, DEI issues, was Cast by Isabel Wilkinson. Absolutely an amazing book. It really does put a lot of things in perspective. And I really enjoy this book and I recommend it to everyone. Because we hear a lot of rhetoric, but just to sit back and read this book or listen to this book from Audible, it will definitely open your eyes and allow you to see a different perspective. And I think that's important. Another great book, because we are in the pandemic, I read The Great Influenza by John M. Barry, which I highly recommend. And then I had one by Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, another amazing book. Again, looking at understanding where we have been. And I love the quote from Alex Haley, because growing up in America, we always exposed to roots. We won't know where we're going until we understand where we have been. And I think that is important. We have to know our past as we continue to forge our future. So those are the books that I would highly recommend if anyone is interested, because it deals with DEI, and we also have dealing with the first pandemic that American society went through. And you'll see it was amazing similarities with the Great Influenza.
Well, fantastic recommendations. And I have not read these books myself, so I'm going to add them to my personal list. Listeners, Cast, The Great Influenza, and Stamped from the Beginning. We'll be putting these on our reading list on our website for you all to find there. And of course, as a scientist, you've got great opportunities to make positive impacts on the world, to do some really cool research and to work with some wonderful people. And one of the opportunities we haven't talked about, though, yet has been travel. And this is something, of course, the pandemic has put a bit of a damper on. But when you think about the places that you've been for science, Nathan, is there one that really sticks out in your memory that you want to tell us about?
It is so funny because I think about it because most of the travel recently has been via Zoom. Mm-hmm. But the ones that stick out to me is when I do go and visit the elementary schools. I remember beaming myself into, based from my sister-in-law in New York, at a school in Wellsville, New York. And it was just absolutely amazing for them to see a person of color. It's a predominantly white area. And I remember the questions the students asked, and it was just a rewarding experience to share what I do and to talk about the brain with young individuals and inspiring them. And I remember, and after I did it, they all sent me letters. And I remember opening the letters and they had color, and some of them drew a scientist, and they drew a scientist with brown skin, et cetera. It was just amazing. I mean, I've done lots of talks, international as well as domestic. But if I had to think about how my science or what I do have impacted a group of individuals, I think about my visits to the elementary schools.
I love it. And I know kids are good at asking unexpected questions. Do you have a particular question that you remember someone asked that you were sort of taken aback by, or maybe even the most common question you do get asked?
One of the most common questions I get asked is, can the brain feel pain, right? If I poke my brain, will I feel pain? Mm-hmm. And another question was, is there anything I could do without the brain? And I love this question. It always throws me off. I was like, absolutely not, right? So I tell them, no, you need a brain to do everything. And also remind them the importance of sleeping and importance of eating the right nutrition and also getting the appropriate amount of sleep in order for their brain to develop very well. Because they always get questions like, do I have to eat vegetables in order for my brain to be healthy? A lot of things like that. Some of those questions are fascinating, but it does help them understand why the appropriate nutrition and sleep is important for brain development.
Definitely. Well, I love it. It sounds like you've had fun with some of these outreach opportunities working with students. And I think we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I think the public has a particular perception about scientists, what they're like, what they look like, and how they're portrayed in the media is often not how scientists are in real life. So we love trying to break some of those stereotypes with our show here. And I know every lab has quirks and traditions, and scientists are people too. They're these creative, funny, multifaceted, amazing people. So do you have a story or an example of this kind of human side of science, Nathan, that you can tell us about that people don't often get to see?
From one of my experiences, like going and doing outreach, especially when the camera comes on and people see you for the first time, it is like literally, I love the fact that you brought up breaking the stereotypes, is everyone has this unique stereotype about what a scientist should look like. Or this mad scientist in a lab with white hair and white skin. They don't leave, or they're unable to connect with individuals or talk to them or just be themselves with individuals. So I think by having the students see a scientist of color, and literally in this classroom, it was their first time seeing a scientist of color, which helps broaden their vision. I don't know if it was shocking because I know most kids don't think in that way, but it definitely broadened their experience in the sense of, oh, okay. It was just like that individual here in Washington, D.C. at Marie Reed, when he asked me, do you think I could be a doctor or a scientist? It just broadened their experience and like helped them think outside the box that they can reach and shoot for the stars, that anything is possible. That's what I always look at, because I always look at people's body language and facial expressions when I do pop up on the screen. With the name Nathan Smith, you can't imagine what you're going to get, but then I pop up on the screen and like, oh, and then it's like, oh, wow, you were really cool. Or something like that, especially when I start talking about my martial arts. So like, oh, you seem normal.
I absolutely love it. And we've talked about these outreach experiences, and I think these are phenomenal ways to really get out there in the world and to change how people perceive scientists or the picture that they have in their head when they hear the word scientist. But I'd love to talk about your lab as well. I think having a great lab environment and treating people as people in the lab is so important. So can you talk a little bit about your lab? Do you have any particular traditions, or what's it like working with you in the lab?
So my lab have trainees both from high school as well as undergraduate and a graduate student and a lab tech. And when I meet each individual student, I go through a presentation. I make it simple. I give them a reading list and we go through it. But the one thing I always stress to them, because I don't want them to stress out. And again, I always remind them, I know what you're feeling right now, this overwhelmed feeling, because I used to sit in the seat that you're sitting in. But what I relate to them is that fact that never be afraid to ask a question. No question is stupid, because again, it will save you a lot of time. So I have personally trained the majority of my students when they come in the lab, being an investigator who still do experiments, et cetera. And it has been some rewarding experiences. Now, I recruit students from all over. My first student was a high school student from Thomas Jefferson High School, Magnet School in Northern Virginia. And she was great. I'll never forget. It's like she came in extremely shy and everything. So Juan was absolutely amazing. By the time she finished within a year, she was asking questions. She wasn't shy anymore. And she was leading projects and everything else. And you would have thought that she was a graduate student. So one of the biggest things, not only get them to ask questions, like I said, but I instill that confidence in them. And that's important for them to have the confidence of not being shy or putting forward a question, but continuing to ask questions and probe questions if you don't understand anything, or someone is explaining something that's not there. And some of the traditions that I like to do with my students is like any victory, small or large, we all go out and celebrate. All right. We all go out and celebrate with lunch. Being a son of Louisiana, I always celebrate Mardi Gras. So I always have king cake for my students. And we go through the Mardi Gras celebration, crowning the king or queen of Mardi Gras. But also I like, if my students need anything, they always can reach out to me and ask a question. And I try to make myself available to them as much as possible. If they have any problems or they're feeling discouraged, my door is always open, because I think it's important for them to know that, look, I am with you. I stand behind you. I support you in any way, shape, or form. Just to remind them that it's okay. You have a bad day. It's okay if the experiment didn't work, right? This is science. It's not going to work the first time. So that's the type of lab I run. And also, one most important thing is to not make it a competitive environment amongst my people. I always remind them we're in this together. We work as a team. We are a team. We don't compete amongst one another, because I have seen what toxic cultures in lab could do to individuals, and I vowed to never have that. I work with my students, and they know that they are all on the same team, and they work together as a team, because I think that's important. And as a team, we support one another.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think having this welcoming and collaborative lab environment is so key to the student success and making sure they have a good experience in whatever training stage they are in their career. And I think it allows you to really do better science as well. And I know oftentimes as a scientist, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, you've got all these barriers that you're facing. So you don't need to add any to the pile. But if we took all these barriers away, Nathan, and you were able to answer anything or do any project, what is the one research question you would want to tackle first?
The one research question I would like to answer first is the role of astrocytes and what are they doing in insulin resistance, whether by having a team to image in vivo within the brain, the living animal, the calcium dynamics, why the animals or the mouse models are doing different tasks. That's what I would do while they are in acute insulin resistance. That is one of the things I would do.
Interesting. So what's the main barrier keeping you from this dream project?
I guess the main barrier is funding and getting more people, because COVID also did a lot of damage when it shut down the lab as well. And also working in a hospital environment, onboarding people and getting them back in, because it was only essential personnel that could come back in. So those are the two things, getting more people into the lab now that we're moving, hopefully we're moving, knock on wood, post-COVID, and getting funding for this particular project. So that's what I would be working on.
Well, we wish you all the best as you move towards answering some really interesting questions in the lab, and hopefully you'll be able to get funding and people lined up for this particular project. And we appreciate you sharing so many of your stories and your expertise with us, Nathan, on the show today. But I'd love to end by talking about advice. For our listeners out there who may be on their own scientific journeys, do you have a particular piece of advice that you received at some point that was just the best advice that really helped you that you can pay forward today?
I have several pieces, but I would go in order. Mm-hmm. The first order is don't be afraid to self-advocate. Ask for what you need. Ask for the resources you need in order to be successful. It is very important for you to actually advocate for yourself and say, this is what I need, or else this project cannot be done. Another piece of advice, especially that I got from my grandmother and mother early on, is never let someone define who you are. In other words, you cannot let someone tell you, based on very limited knowledge about you, that you can't be something you've set out to be. So never let anyone define who you are. And my last piece of advice is you have up and down days, but you have to just keep moving forward. You have to continue to move forward and use those down days as teachable moments, because there is light at the end of the tunnel. And there will be rain before you make it to that light at the end of the tunnel, and storms and lots of barriers standing in your way. But when you emerge at the end of the tunnel with that light, you will be stronger for it. So just keep moving forward. Whatever you do, do not give up. Giving up is not an option.
I like it. Well, Nathan, wonderful advice and wonderful message there for our listeners. Is there any last note you'd like to leave them with, whether it's one last piece of advice, a message of inspiration, or just a goodbye?
Yes, I would say believe in yourself. I always say that when people are like, oh, I want to make sure that certain people believe that I could do it. Well, before other people could believe that you could do something, you have to believe in yourself. That must come first. Believe in yourself, because you actually can do anything you set your mind to. It is important. Believe in yourself and be willing to put in the hard work. But first, you must believe that you can do it.
Well, wonderful note to end our conversation on today, Nathan. Now, I know you've shared a lot and we've sort of touched just a little bit on your research. So if our listeners want to learn more about you and the exceptional work that you're doing, what is the best way for them to do so?
You can go to my website at www.thesmithlaboratory.org. That again is www.thesmithlaboratory.org. And you can learn about the research project and also see some of the wonderful trainees that I've had in the lab and who are in the lab as well. And learn about opportunities for joining my lab and come and do some exciting research with us.
Phenomenal. Well, listeners, definitely check out Nathan's lab website. And Nathan, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you for this opportunity. I'm so happy that I was available to do it. I'm just excited.
Well, I'm delighted that we were able to connect here. Listeners, it's been wonderful to have you here with us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.